Buenas tardes, les damos la bienvenida a esta nueva lección de la Cátedra Doctoral de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, María Montessori, las mujeres en educación y pedagogía. Hoy tenemos una invitada muy especial, la doctora María Robaszkiewicz, ya la presentaré en un momento. Ella, como ustedes vieron en la programación, va a hacer una disertación sobre Hanna Arendt, Education for Judgment in Times of Crisis. Ya tendremos ocasión de escucharla. Quiero darle la bienvenida especialmente a la doctora María. Ella se encuentra en este momento en Ontario, Canadá, compartiendo con nosotros este momento. Antes de presentar a María, quisiera también para ella y para todas las personas que nos escuchan, pues enviarles un saludo por parte del profesor David Rubio y la profesora Sandra Durán, con quienes organizamos esta cátedra doctoral. También dar un saludo a todas las personas, estudiantes del doctorado en educación de la Universidad Pedagógica que se conectan hoy. También asisten estudiantes del doctorado pero que cursan el programa en otras universidades. Este programa, María, está hecho por varias universidades, entonces también tenemos estudiantes de universidades colombianas como la Universidad Distrital, que queda aquí en Bogotá, y la Universidad del Valle, que queda en Cali. También a esta cátedra, a este espacio, asisten estudiantes de nuestras maestrías de la Universidad Pedagógica y estudiantes de lo que llamamos en Colombia el pregrado. Son las carreras para nosotros en la Universidad Pedagógica donde se forman profesores de distintas áreas. Entonces aquí compartimos con estudiantes tanto de doctorado como de maestría y estudiantes del pregrado. También, por supuesto, dar un saludo muy especial a las personas que se conectan, que están en otras regiones de Colombia. Se conectan usualmente personas de Medellín, de Barranquilla, de Manizales, de Cúcuta, etcétera, de muchas ciudades de Colombia, y queremos darles un saludo, pero también otras personas de fuera del país que usualmente siguen esta cátedra en México, en Honduras, en Panamá, en Argentina, en Chile, en Ecuador, en Perú, muchos lugares de Latinoamérica donde construimos una comunidad académica, educativa. En este caso continuamos con esa preocupación, eso que nos interesa mucho, que es conversar, investigar, analizar las propuestas de las mujeres en educación y pedagogía a propósito de la conmemoración de los 70 años de María Montessori. Hemos tenido varias conferencias sobre María Montessori, pero también sobre otras mujeres que han hecho grandes aportes a la educación, Marta Nussbaum, María Zambrano, Olga Lucía Zuluaga, entre otras. Entonces hoy continuamos con esta exploración pensando en incentivar, en motivar, en que haga parte de nuestras reflexiones, de nuestro conocimiento pedagógico. Para eso hemos invitado a María Robaszkiewicz. María, voy a hacer una pequeña presentación de María Robaszkiewicz. Ella es profesora asistente en la Universidad de Paderborn en Alemania y es investigadora asociada en el Center for History of Women Philosophers and Scientists. Es miembro del comité ejecutivo de la Society for Study of Women in Phenomenology, tanto como miembro del grupo editorial de hannaharendt.net. Estudió filosofía y educación en la Universidad de Łódź, en Polonia. También en la Universidad bueno, aquí sí me perdonan mi pronunciación de finlandés. Jyväskylä.
Jyväskylä.
Ok, en Finlandia. y en la Universidad de Bonn, en Alemania. Obtuvo su doctorado en 2015 con un estudio sobre el concepto de ejercicio en el pensamiento político en Hannah Arendt y su importancia hoy, que fue una tesis publicada en 2017 en Springer. Fue la organizadora principal del Congreso Internacional e Interdisciplinario Hannah Arendt Challenges of Plurality, que se desarrolló en Paderborn, en la Universidad de Paderborn en Alemania en 2018. Sus intereses investigativos incluyen teorías de la migración, la recepción del pensamiento de Hannah Arendt en el pensamiento político, en la fenomenología política también, y la teoría feminista. Su actual investigación, su proyecto actual de investigación se centra en un examen fenomenológico de la experiencia de la migración desde la perspectiva de una crítica fenomenológica o fenomenología crítica. Actualmente es una investigadora visitante en el Centro de Estudio de Teoría y Crítica de Western University en Ontario, Canadá, desde donde nos acompaña en este momento. María, muchas gracias por aceptar esta invitación. Estamos ansiosos por escucharte y desde luego te transmito también muchos saludos que ya están escribiendo los estudiantes aquí en el chat, que también pues están gustosos de escucharte. María.
Buenas tardes y muchas gracias, Maximiliano. Lo siento, pero mi castellano es muy mal, which is why I will continue in English. But perhaps if you have questions that you would like to pose in Spanish in our discussion with Maximiliano's help, I think we can make it work. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for presenting me in such kind words. Let us start with the fact that we are meeting here today within a series of talks for the anniversary of Maria Montessori, who is definitely an educator and a theorist of education, and also a philosopher. What is quite curious is that I am going to speak about Hannah Arendt, who doubted herself to be a philosopher and also explicitly said that she was not an educator. My talk, that is titled Education for Judgment in the Times of Crisis, will begin with me giving you a short introduction to different aspects of what I will be speaking today, because I'm not entirely sure if this is common knowledge or not. So I thought I would not risk, but rather say some things that for some of you may be already known, but I don't think it's so bad to repeat some basics in order for me to know that you can follow my arguments. The talk will be divided in two parts. I will be speaking freely in the first part, and I will have a short presentation, which I will share with you in just a moment. And then in the second part, I will read a piece of text, and I will only show you the three longer quotations that I have within this text, so that you can follow them better. I think it's always very helpful. Fine. So let me see if we can do it like this. Okay, fine. All right. So that's me, that's the talk, but you know that already. So let me begin with just a couple of words about Arendt's biography. So she was born in Hanover in Germany to a Jewish couple, and her father died when she was a very small child, upon which her mother moved with her to Königsberg, where Hannah Arendt grew up. Her mother remarried, so she had a new family. Her mother was also a person who, to a certain extent, influenced not only her childhood, but perhaps her whole life, because her mother was politically engaged as a communist, and she was especially a fan of Rosa Luxemburg. This does not mean that Arendt became a communist, but it does mean that she had contact to political engagement from her early years. What was really meaningful in her life already as a child was the fact of her being a Jew, which simply had a profound influence on her life already, as I said, as a child and adolescent. When Arendt finished school, she went to study first in Berlin and then later in Marburg. She was following her work, what you could maybe see as her fate, because already as a relatively young person, she was sure that she absolutely needed to study philosophy. So she did study philosophy, and she followed the call that was widespread among young people in philosophy at that time, namely that Martin Heidegger was the person to go to study philosophy for real. So she did that. And then there was part of her life, which is to some the most known fact in her life, regrettably, her short affair with Heidegger. Heidegger was around 35. I don't know right now exactly, and she was 17. So right now we would not really condone a situation like this. Back then it was probably less a scandal, and of course hardly anyone knew about it. After they split it, again, after a really short time, she went to study with Jaspers, with whom she graduated with a book about Saint Augustine. And I think Maximiliano knows quite a lot about this book and what interesting things one can learn from it. Then after her graduation, she worked a little bit for Jewish organizations because the situation in Germany, slowly but surely, was getting worse in terms of political influence of National Socialists. So she worked with Zionist organizations, but she never became a Zionist. It was more her idea of wanting to do something for community, and since she was a Jew herself and she had Jewish contacts, Zionists it were. Arendt wrote in this time, or was working on a book about Rahel Varnhagen, who was a 18th century salonier in Berlin. but she did not. It was supposed to be her second academic book, but she didn't finish it at that time because National Socialists overtook power in Germany, upon which Arendt left Germany immediately and went to France, where she spent some time first before the war among other international intellectuals, and then after the war started, after Germany invaded France, she and her husband have done everything to leave Europe and go to the United States to rescue themselves. As they arrived there, what happened was that they would not get a US nationality or US citizenship right away. And it's really dured 10 years until Arendt became a US citizen. And it was another moment in her life, after fleeing Europe, it was another moment in her life that shaped her as a political theorist. She then got a scholarship for writing another book, which was The Origins of Totalitarianism. And really relatively shortly after the Second World War ended, because the book was published in 1951, she produced a really thorough study of how totalitarianism could occur in the political sphere. So what elements would contribute to its appearance. This study was discussed hotly and criticized a lot, but still it made her famous overnight, basically. So this is how her academic career, which she could not pursue in the first year when she was in America, because she had no funds to live, basically, and not to do research, of course. But this book started her academic career, and she became a professor in New York at the New School for Social Research and Yale University and University of Chicago. She has written a couple of quite well-known books. Perhaps the best known of those is The Human Condition, which is a political ontology of the world. And I will be actually mainly referring to two other books of her in this talk. The first one will be the lectures on Kant's political philosophy, which is a book that has a history of its own. In her late years, Arendt decided to write perhaps a little bit less about politics, although, of course, these books remain very political, but perhaps more about philosophy. And she started to write a trilogy called The Life of the Mind. Part 1 was thinking, part 2 was willing, and part 3 was supposed to be judging. But unfortunately, Arendt died in 1975 before she could finish or even, properly start working on this third volume of the trilogy. So what we do have are her notes from lectures that she was holding at the University of Chicago shortly before. And this is how we can reconstruct her theory of judgment. So it was not actually anything really ripe or, ready and finished, which is, I think, as an example for us how to read Arendt's writings altogether, but I will come back to it in due time during my talk. So I will now, if it works, I will now show you a short clip. It's an interview with Hannah Arendt in 1964, where she speaks about how she sees herself. And she sees herself neither, well, no, okay, she's not speaking about education here. She's speaking about education elsewhere. I will come back to it, but she does not see herself as a philosopher, as we will see in just a second when I manage to. Okay. Sorry for that. Okay.
Frau Hannah Arendt, Sie sind die erste Frau, die in dieser Reihe porträtiert werden soll. Die erste Frau, wenn auch freilich mit einer nach landläufiger Vorstellung höchst männlichen Beschäftigung. Sie sind Philosophin. Darf ich von dieser Vorbemerkung zu meiner ersten Frage kommen? Empfinden Sie Ihre Rolle im Kreise der Philosophen trotz der Anerkennung und des Respekts, den man ihnen zollt, als eine Besonderheit? Oder berühren wir damit ein Emanzipationsproblem, das für Sie nie existiert hat?
Ja, ich fürchte, ich muss erst einmal protestieren. Ich gehöre nicht in den Kreis der Philosophen. Mein Beruf, wenn man davon überhaupt sprechen kann, ist politische Theorie. Ich fühle mich keineswegs als Philosophen. Ich bin auch nicht, ich glaube nicht, in den Kreis der Philosophen aufgenommen, wie Sie freundlicherweise meinen. Aber wenn wir auf die andere Frage zu sprechen kommen, die Sie in der Vorbemerkung anschnitten, Sie sagen, es ist landläufig eine männliche Beschäftigung. Nun, es braucht ja nicht eine männliche Beschäftigung zu bleiben. Es könnte ja durchaus sein, dass auch eine Frau einmal eine Philosophin sein wird.
Ich halte sie für eine solche.
Ja, also dagegen kann ich nichts machen. Aber ich selber darf doch auch eine Meinung äußern. Und meine Meinung ist, dass ich keine Philosophin bin. Ich habe meiner Meinung nach der Philosophie doch endgültig valid gesagt. Ich habe Philosophie studiert, wie Sie wissen, aber das besagt ja noch nicht, dass ich dabei geblieben bin.
So, as you see, oh, no, that's not what I wanted, sorry. I'm sorry. How did I do that? Okay. So, as you could see, Arendt did not see herself as a philosopher. And as I read her, there were certain reasons for that. And the main reason was the reaction of intellectuals in general and philosophers especially. And Heidegger was her main example here to the overtake of power by National Socialists in Germany. So all of a sudden, all those people who seemed to be so smart and so well oriented in the world would follow National Socialists with their racist, anti-Semitic ideology and with their rule of terror. This was a great disappointment to Arendt, and the reason for her to distance herself from philosophy. She thought that philosophers had a kind of a professional disease, which is that through the way they are working, through the fact that their main activity is thinking, they retrieve from the world to think about things that are eternal and objective and so on and so forth. So they would lose contact to the actual world where people live together, act together, and speak together. And this made them incapable as political agents. And because Arendt was always interested in politics, she said, oh no, philosophy is nothing for me, not anymore, because philosophers are inept as political agents. So this is why I started my talk with telling you that we are speaking about philosophers and educators, and Arendt was not a philosopher and not an educator. So what I will do in this talk today, I will be speaking about her concept of reflective judgment. And I have to tell you right now, so that you have a good understanding of what I'm talking about, that reflective judgment, and political thinking are all the same. Arendt is using them interchangeably in her work. So anytime I use any of those notions, I mean the same. Then I will be presenting you with her concept of exercises in political thinking, and I will tell you a little bit about what I think one can do with that and why it is, in my opinion, the most fruitful what you can find in her work. Not that it's the only fruitful way, but I absolutely love this concept because it's possible to apply it to so many topics and to make her theory really work in practice. And it's also very important for education. Then I will be speaking about two of her essays where she speaks about education. Well, you can argue, and as we were, as Maximiliano and I were speaking before my talk today, that's also the essay "What is Authority" could be included here, but I'm not including it. I'm sorry. Anyway, and then we will come to the end of the talk when I will be speaking about education for judgment. So first, let me tell you what Arendt meant by political thinking or reflective judgment. First, let me go back to her concept of philosophical thinking. So when she distanced herself from philosophy, she was using an understanding of philosophy that I call metaphysical thinking. So a philosopher drawing himself back from the world into the kingdom of thought, where he is not disturbed by the world, not disturbed by all the unforeseeability of the world and of human action, and he looks at things as they really are. So this was a vision that Arendt could not accept for politics for the reasons I mentioned. But then she found counter-conception of thinking that could be used for her political purposes, let's say. And it was Socratic thinking. And she adopted this concept of thinking as a silent dialogue between me and myself, as her concept of thinking that would, as I will show shortly, enable political judgment and political action. The point here is that in Socratic thinking, I do not retreat from the world fully. So I'm thinking, as Plato described this way of dialogical thinking or dialectical thinking. My thinking is always influenced by experience. So what happens to me, what I observe, it is never completely a part of the world. So what is also happening there is that I am not alone. I am not somewhere in a void, in a kingdom of thought, but I'm talking to somebody, and this somebody happens to be me myself, but I am leading a dialogue. So perhaps you have experienced that already, really perceiving one's thinking as a deliberation. So I'm saying to myself, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to do that. And then I say, well, I'm not sure because there are reasons not to do it. And then reasons not to have this perspective, or not to have this opinion, or whatever else. And then I answer to myself again, and so it goes. This means that there's a certain plurality in thinking already. And plurality is an absolutely central notion for Arendt's thinking. So basically, plurality is the fact that there are many people on the earth, but it also means that we are all equal as human beings, but we are also, like every one of us, is radically unique as a new person that comes into the world. And I have to go on quite quickly, I guess, through this part so that I don't prolong my lecture. So I will go on to judging as enlarged thinking. So after adopting Socratic thinking, Arendt developed another activity of the mind, which was judging, based on Kant's third critique, so critique of judgment. We have to say here that her interpretation was really quite strange. So it was not a Kantian interpretation of Kant. She just took a couple of elements from Kant and used them to shape her own theory. So one of her in early interpreters, Margaret Canavan, called this interpretation. Oh, I'm missing the word right now. Okay, if I remember, I will come back to it. Anyway, the interpretation was very strange and not obvious. So she would interpret Kant's theory of judgment for her political aims, which was to ask, how do I make political judgments? So, and if I said political judgments in my last sentence, what I meant was aesthetic judgment. So she used Kant's theory of aesthetic judgment to ask about how we could make political judgments. And she said, hey, okay, so this third critique of Kant was his actual political philosophy, hence the title of the lectures. And what he was doing there was just showing that in political matters, we cannot operate with absolute truths, but we have to speak about opinions that are something very, very different, that are something which is open to rethinking, to revising, further developing. They are not final, and they are many. So we can have many opinions who do not fit to one another like a jigsaw puzzle, but somehow add up to form our worldview. But they are not stable, so we can rethink them. We can change our opinions. We can get influence. We can add new information and new positions that would influence our opinion so that we change it. And this is exactly what Arendt was aiming at, namely a way of worldly thinking, of political thinking that would not be outside of the world, but would be on the verge of the world. Not yet action, but already something that presupposes action. So what Kant develops is a theory of aesthetic judgment. And one of the points that he makes is that this kind of judgment needs a plurality of perspectives. So we cannot make a well-informed opinion, form a well-informed opinion, taking into consideration our point of view only. So what would be done there is enlarging one's thinking, so imagining other perspectives. And Arendt makes it very clear. So it is imagining to think as if I was somebody else, but at the same time knowing that I am not this person, that I am not at this point from which the person is looking at things. I'm just imagining how it would be if, knowing that I might be wrong. I can imagine as well as I can. I should see that I take into consideration in my imaginary community of judgment, that I take into consideration a plurality of different perspectives. And the more different perspectives I take into consideration, the better informed would be my judgment. And those perspectives should, of course, be different from one another. And here I always think about, bubbles that we are closing ourselves in these days. And probably it's not only a current, but also a historical phenomenon. But bubbling is exactly the opposite of opening your imaginary community of judgment. So the more different perspectives you consider, the better your judgment. And judgment is, in a way, something that stands between thinking and acting. So judgment is still an activity of the mind, but at the same time, it informs action, but not in the sense of me being forced to act upon my judgment, but rather to give me a certain foundation or a hint how I could judge. How I could act. The point also is that for Arendt, although I have no space here to develop this much further, but for Arendt, acting is always acting in plurality. So I cannot act alone. I have to act with others who are obviously, as I already mentioned, radically unique human beings. So what this results with is, you can say a big chaos, perhaps, but a big chaos that still remains more a web of relationships than chaos or so itself. It means that future action or generally the future of human acting is not foreseeable, because you cannot foresee what happens when certain people come together, each of them being radically unique, bringing to the world the new, acting together and through that producing a common outcome of action. You would never know. You would never know what opinions, what actions would add to it. So the sphere of the political is very uncertain in Arendt, which is, one could say, a positive thing, because if you think more thoroughly, you certainly see that this is the basis of any democratic rule. You have to have more than one opinion, and you have to have more than one possibility of action. To have freedom of action, to have a possibility to develop something new, instead of, say, if we had just one opinion, as for example in the example of National Socialism, the democratic political order is simply not possible. Everyone needs to agree to this one direction. So the one thing that we have to say about political thinking is that we are not born with that. We are born with the capability of acting for Arendt, but we are not born with the capability of political thinking. So what we need to do is we need to train or learn to think politically. The question is, of course, how to do that. And Arendt does not say that very clearly, because the concept of exercises in political thinking is something that she discusses very, very shortly. Even though this is the subtitle of her essay collection, Between Past and Future, 8 Exercises in Political Thinking, I made a tiny mistake here because I was writing with my own interpretation in mind. The subtitle is 8 Exercises in Political Thought. I think thinking is more apt at this point, because it is directed towards an action and not a passive mode, as thought would suggest. So she's only talking very shortly about the exercises in the introduction to this essay collection. And she says, these essays are exercises in political thinking. So I'm not telling my readers what they should think. I would like to show them how to think about political matters. So what she's showing is she's not fleshing out her theories, but she's writing essays. So she's trying to approach the political thinking as a matter that should be learned and exercised throughout our lives. And here you can see in this short citation that she was very explicit about the practical side of those exercises. So an exercise in thinking can be one, like all experience in doing something, only through practice, through exercises. So exercises indeed are the practice of judgment, but it does not mean that they are, well, I will come to that later also, but it does not mean that they are somehow a preparation that comes before judging. So exercises in judgment are already equal to making judgment. So their aims is, as I said, to gain experience in how to think politically. And they have two sides. The first one being the first one being critique, and the second one being experiment. And as Arendt explains that shortly, critique is to try to look at certain matters from a perspective or many perspectives that go beyond my own perspective or opinion. And then the experimental part is trying to imagine what could be, how I could make judgments about a matter, what I would need for that, and what hinders me. Those essays in the collection are also divided into parts, and the first part of the book is more in this critical guise, and the second part is more experimental. What you can see very, very clearly is that Arendt is writing essays, not only in this book, but as I would argue, she's writing essays always. So every of her writing is an essay. Even The Origins of Totalitarianism, and it's a book of over 1,000 pages, is an essay. Arendt tries to judge about some historical events, how it happened that certain elements converged into a political phenomenon or non-political phenomenon in her own interpretation. But it's an attempt, it's an essay. It's not a theory fair and square. And I think this is a very valuable element of her thinking and a very fruitful way of reading her texts, which have been criticized on many points. But if you make clear for yourself that these are just attempts to think about things about which you cannot say something that would be valid forever, because politics is acting together of many people, and it can never be defined as an object. It is always in motion. It is always in development. So trying to judge about these matters needs an essayistic attitude. And this is, in my interpretation, exactly what Arendt is doing. So I will now move to the second part of my talk, where I speak more about education at last. So I will show you this picture for this part of the talk, which is a photo from an exhibition titled on Hannah Arendt, The Crisis in Education, and which shows photographs of Eleanor, Antine, Nancy, and Davy. And it took place in a gallery in London, 2021. The crisis in education. In the last part of the essay collection, Between Past and Future, Arendt presents how the practices of political thinking she introduces in the first two sections of the book can be applied to contemporary issues and problems. Her aim in doing so is not to offer technical solutions to these problems, but to apply political thought in an exemplary way. As a result, she develops her judgment regarding some issues that were for her of political relevance, as still very timely the role of truth in politics or the human conquest of space, which, like any political judgment, is positioned, partial, and temporary, hence seeking to gain more truth, seeking to become more truthful in regard to these specific everyday problems in their political relevance. The essayistic attitude that underlies Arendt's political writing is thus particularly evident in this experimental part of the collection, as what she presents to her readers is her perspective on the selected aspect of political events current to her, as a possible point of view among others. Obviously, her perspectives are well informed, and so, even if we do not agree with her results, they can become models or examples of political judgment one can orient oneself upon when engaging in political thinking herself. But at the same time, in Arendt's view, they remain only attempts to address certain issues, because the solutions she proposes are not to be seen in absolute terms, but are rather meant to contribute to the plurality of opinions that makes the common world, the world we share, altogether possible. To her audience, Arendt presents the world as it opens itself up for her. As a reader, one thus receives an example of how to think politically and not what to think. In The Crisis of Education, which I discuss in the following, Arendt engages with school education policies in the United States in the 1950s and presents this issue in a broader cultural context. The key concept of this essay is crisis, and such a claim for Arendt is always ambivalent. It presupposes a destructive moment, but also a constructive one. Her assessment of the situation in education is critical because she sees American pragmatic education, and this essay in the first place is directed against John Dewey, although his name is not mentioned in the essay, as dissolving the possibilities of reaching out to historical and contemporary models of thinking and acting previously able to provide orientation in the world. And actually, one can read this essay as a critique of analytic philosophy, I would argue. At the same time, however, a crisis holds an opportunity to look at the old problems which can no longer be solved by traditional means from a new perspective. And I quote, "The opportunity provided by the very fact of crisis, which tears away facades and obliterates prejudices, to explore and inquire into whatever has been laid bare of the essence of the matter," quote end. A crisis only proves disastrous when the reaction to it consists in recourse to the ways of thinking prescribed by tradition, answered in conventional schematic ways. In the critical spirit of the exercises in political thinking, Arendt reminds her readers that prejudices and established patterns of thought prove useless under these conditions. Thus, the crisis in education is an occasion for her to argue for the need for political judgment on the part of every inhabitant of the common world. The need for political thinking goes hand in hand with the postulated return to the original questions of human coexistence, and thus to the genuine political experience that Arendt illustrates through the topos of life in the polis, as described in Aristotle's Politics. This involves a possibility of political engagement of the individual as an individual, not as a representative of a predefined political directive. Arendt herself made use of this newfound political freedom. She followed her judgment in every matter and did not allow for assigning her to any specific theoretical or political frame. She was famous for saying that she would not become a member of any club. When discussing questions of education, which did not concern her personally, but did concern her politically, Arendt emphasizes the Socratic character of political thinking. Without, as she stresses, being an expert, she begins to ponder a problem consider other perspectives, and formulate tentative conclusions in order to make her doxa, so her opinion, more truthful, in the sense it being the way in which the world opens up to a subject. The background of Arendt's critique in The Crisis of Education mirrors the narrative known from The Human Condition, which is arguably Arendt's best-known book, of the demise of the modern world in which tradition and authority have lost their validity. Oh, I have authority at least once in this talk, okay? So, for its inhabitants pursuing action in public, this entails the need for independent judgment. The political space, no longer held together by tradition, must reinvent itself. And this transformation allows the original modes of political thought and action to be rediscovered. In the field of education, the situation is different. Naturally and historically, education is based on authority. And without this foundation, it is plunged into a crisis. Without clear authorities, children are left to their own devices, as if they were capable of establishing a world of their own. At the same time, Arendt argues against, in Aristotelian manner, children as, I quote, people in the process of unfolding, quote end, need protection, which is to be provided by adults whose task is to introduce children into the world. They, as newcomers, must first get to know. At the same time, children should be protected from premature entering the public sphere. The responsibility of adults in this respect is twofold. On the one hand, they are responsible for the children, their well-being and gradual preparation for acting in the public. On the other hand, they are responsible for the common world itself. And I quote, "Human parents have not only summoned their children into life through conception and birth, they have simultaneously introduced them into a world. In education, they assume responsibility for both, for the life and development of the child, and for the continuance of the world." Quote end. The responsibility for the world in which children are to be at home is a political one, and it is not only draws on the past, but it is also expressed through concern for the future of the common world. And I come to my first long quotation. And it is a quotation from The Crisis of Education. "Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token, save it from the ruin which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from the world and leave them to their own devices, not to strike them from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing our common world." Thus, the spheres of education and politics, which according to Arendt should remain strictly separated, are reunited only when adult citizens assume the dual responsibility I was just speaking about. So let us take a look at the meaning of the separation between politics and education in Arendt. Arendt argues that these spheres should remain separate in both essays she devotes to the topic. So the first one being The Crisis in Education, and the second one being Reflections on Literary Rock, which recently became a subject of critique in the context of race and anti-racism in Arendt, especially in books by Danielle Allen and Catherine T. Jones. And I cannot discuss this essay here in full detail, But the gist is that Arendt's critique of what she saw as instrumentalization and abuse of African American children through directly engaging them in the fight for desegregation in the US South was problematic to these authors. The recent publication showed that in this case, Arendt definitely did not live up to the ideal of reflective judgment. And if you are interested in discussing this further, we could do it during the Q&As. But back to the topic. In The Crisis of Education, Arendt emphasizes that, I quote, "Whoever wants to educate adults really wants to act as their guardian and prevent them from political activity." And she reaches the following conclusion. I quote, "Not just teachers and educators, but all of us, insofar as we live in one world together with our children and with young people, must take toward them an attitude radically different from the one we take toward one another. We must decisively divorce the realm of education from the others, most of all from the public realm, the realm of the public, political life." And then in Reflections on Literal Rock, she writes, "However, the most startling part of the whole business was the federal decision to start integration in, of all places, the public schools. It certainly did not require too much imagination to see that this was a burden children, black and white, with the working out of a problem which adults for generations have confessed themselves unable to solve. Have we now come to the point where it is the children who are being asked to change or improve the world? And do we intend to have our political battles fought out in the schoolyards?" Quote end. Oh, sorry. Let's stay with that. For Arendt, the background of the separation between education and politics lies primarily in concern for the children, who, exposed to the light of the public, are instrumentalized in the political conflicts they cannot yet understand. Politics must be progressive, but the new world, Arendt argues, must never be sought through education, but must always be negotiated among adults in the actual public sphere. Children, as radically new and exceptional beings, bring to the world a gift for beginning the new. When education takes on a form of political indoctrination, treating the new as a faire incomplete, it becomes a tyrannical affair. This judgment can certainly be tracked back to Arendt's experience of totalitarian rule, the aggressive appropriation of all spheres of life by National Socialists who sought to impose their ideology as an ultimate truth, began at the point of educating and molding young people into obedient followers of the Führer. As the National Socialist ideology is in no way compatible with Arendt's concept of politics, these practices exemplify in an extreme form how destructive it proves when a preconceived imaginary of a world is being imposed on children and the actual bringers of the new. The risk, in her view, is too high, so the spheres of politics and education must be kept apart. Although the arguments Arendt makes for her separation between education and politics are plausible, her postulate is not unproblematic. The task of education, after all, is to introduce children into the world as it is, as she writes. And this world, in Arendtian terms, is metaphorically speaking a web of past and present human relationships, or a public sphere. Through education, then, a certain form of introducing into political coexistence needs to be provided. According to Arendt, human beings are born with the ability of spontaneous free action in the sense of beginning something new. But it not be sufficient it would not be sufficient for responsible political participation in face of the crisis of tradition. So how can Arendtian education prepare the newcomers for the task of co-creating the common world if it must not be done by direct ideological influence? Education for judgment, the, I quote, political knowledge par excellence, seems to be the right choice. Here I'll refer to Stacy Smith's classic account of education for judgment. Smith develops her project of education for judgment by circumventing Arendt's separation between politics and education. She distinguishes between the two modes of practicing: actual practice on the one hand and preparation for practice on the other. Education for judgment is said to be based on the latter mode, I quote. Insofar as education prepares young people for politics, it is political in that preparation is a unique form of action. Children, as human beings in the process of becoming, make determination regarding objects, and in so doing, they prepare to authentically practice judgment when they become complete human. In Arendtian terms of her Aristotelian notion of a child as being a human being in the process of completion. By differentiating, by differentiating between the exercise and practice of judgment, Smith defines school as a particular kind of public space where children can optimize the judgment under controlled experimental conditions. Teachers need not relinquish their legitimate authority in this process, for school is a political space as if a representation of the world, but not yet the world itself. What can such preparation for participation in the public sphere consist of? Whenever Arendt argues for the protection of children from the light of the public, she refers to examples of political activism and political indoctrination. However, preparing for responsible participation in the political sphere is possible in the form of education for judgment without endangering the children as newcomers. Such a project, however, must respect the nature of political thinking. Smith appreciates the importance of developing judging skills before actually entering the public sphere. For this sake, she rightly argues for the separation between education and politics to be seen as relative, which for her is a precondition for designating schools as an experimental space of action. In her project, however, she leaves the primary framework, assigning political education to schools' unreal space, untouched. Unlike Smith, I do not see the controlled exercising of judgment as a precompetence to its actual practicing. I would rather argue that exercises in reflective judgment are in themselves already reflective judgment. A judgment is being made in an experimental space of action in a like matter as in the real one. This underpins the effectiveness of exercises in political thinking as a propedeutic political practice that becomes an indispensable element of civic education. At the same time, this does not mean that children, adolescents, and young adults, and where the passage from one to another really takes place is another question worth discussing. I'm sorry. If we assume the conventional character of the common voting rights age limit at 18. So no one is committed to act upon their judgment, which does not make it merely experimental in Smith's sense. It does, however, makes it experimental in Arendt's sense, as open to further reflection, unfinished, partial, improvable, enlargeable, and simply not cast in stone. Allowing such judgments, even for younger children, and introducing them into practices of judgment, be it within formal or informal education frames, seems to be at the heart of an Arendt-inspired education for judgment. Its condition is providing not only numerous but also diverse perspectives for exercising political thinking, which in times of social bubbling might prove challenging. The crisis in education opens a perspective, so the essay opens a perspective of education for judgment, the necessity of judgment on the part of every inhabitant of the common world. It is a very apt example of an exercise in political thinking. Its crucial element lies on the one hand, in Arendt's interpretation of the history of United States as a new world that Arendt recounts in the first part of the essay. On the other hand, through the critique of the state of education in 1950s America, informed by her own experience. The experimental, in turn, consists in the judging that Arendt makes and in her reflections on how to think about education after the bridge of tradition. In this exercise in political thinking, Arendt shows how judgment can be exercised in critical matters that do not affect one personally. So Arendt writes as a non-educator. That is the meaning of her statement, exactly, that she ventures into the subject as a layperson. Her answer to the question posed in the essay remains just one among many. Arendt takes it only as far as her competence in judgment allows her. She does, however, send an unmistakable signal through this attempt. The political shaping of the world cannot become a matter for the experts, but depend on the judgment and action of the many individual actors involved in it, who need to continuously exercise political thinking and, when they decide to, express its results and follow up the words with actions. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, María, por esta conferencia tan llena de elementos como para preguntar y seguir pensando, que además ayuda como a relacionar lo que has señalado pues con muchos sectores y muchas preguntas que ocurren tanto en la filosofía, aunque Arendt, tú lo has mencionado, no se considera una filósofa, pero sino también en diversos asuntos que nos atañen en la educación. Bueno, inicialmente pues has hecho como tú lo señalaste, dos partes de tu presentación, partiendo de la biografía de Arendt, pero señalando en el video que nos propusiste que no se considera filósofa. Luego, pues la introducción en la idea del pensamiento político, que es un pensamiento plural, que tiene sus orígenes, claro, en esa tradición, digamos, dialógica, socrática, que siempre me invita a ponerme en los pies del otro. Señalaste también como un origen en la idea kantiana del juicio estético, por supuesto también. Una idea fuerte que decías, la idea de pluralidad del pensamiento político es siempre un pensamiento plural. Bueno, me llama la atención pues cómo se va decantando esto en que la pregunta no es por el qué, sino cómo se va construyendo y cómo es el pensamiento político. Es un pensamiento que no es, que cambia, es inestable, es construido por todos. Implica que no hay una sola persona que tiene como la orientación, también implica que las acciones futuras no pueden ser, digamos, predecibles totalmente, sino que también hay una suerte como de construcción, si se quiere, colectiva en estas acciones. No tiene solo nuestra perspectiva, sino que todo el tiempo nos está haciendo preguntar si yo fuera otra persona en el pensamiento político y en las acciones. Bien, estoy haciendo aquí una traducción al español muy libre, desde luego no serán las palabras más precisas. La pregunta del, bueno, los resultados son inciertos, pero bueno, la pregunta es ¿cómo hacemos ese pensamiento político? Sí, perdona. Bien, no, la apertura los ejercicios de pensamiento político, si se quiere, la práctica del juicio político como un ejercicio y la idea del ensayo como algo que siempre está en construcción. Luego, la idea de crisis de la educación como algo, un momento destructivo y un momento constructivo, la crisis de la educación como una oportunidad sobre todo, y llama ya la atención la idea de bueno, la responsabilidad de los adultos frente a la construcción de un mundo común que no es solamente traer el mundo común del pasado, si se quiere, que es una idea pues usual en la educación, sino es también la construcción, el cuidado, si uno lo quiere llamar de esa manera, de un mundo futuro. La separación, que es un asunto bastante interesante, por no decir problemático, entre la educación y el mundo político, y la educación como también una suerte de preparación. La educación, digamos, uno recuerda también esos textos de Derrida, la educación como sí, ¿no? La educación siempre como un como sí, pero que no por eso está separado totalmente del mundo político. Bueno, la crisis de la educación es una oportunidad para una nueva manera, si se quiere, una manera diferente de pensar del pensamiento político y del ejercicio del pensamiento político, y que nos llama directamente a la educación. He hecho una síntesis muy rápida, desde luego, no detallada ni al pie de la letra de lo que has mencionado, sino rescatando solamente algunas ideas. Bueno, yo quisiera señalar, y también para transmitir algunas preguntas que ya se han escrito aquí en el chat.
Un momento.
Sí, claro.
I've just noticed that while I was rushing through Kant's political philosophy, I somehow skipped the problems and critique. So, of course, this concept of seeing an issue from a perspective which is not only my own is very problematic. Okay. But I somehow failed to speak about that. I'm so sorry. If this appears in the questions, I will be very happy to discuss it in the Q&As.
Ok, esperemos entonces que en las preguntas también se puedan discutir estos asuntos. Yo quisiera, hay un asunto, bueno, desde luego lo que has conversado es si se quiere, una perspectiva política de la educación, una aproximación política hacia la educación, pero que redunda también en la formación política. Es decir, siempre hay una preocupación fuerte en nuestros sistemas educativos por la formación política de nuestros estudiantes, independiente de, digamos, sus intereses particulares. ¿Cómo debe ser esa formación política? Y en tu conferencia mostraste la importancia de separar la educación de la política para que eso no conduzca a adoctrinamientos. Históricamente ha dado ejemplos a eso. Sin embargo, sí consideramos que el proceso formativo es un proceso de formación política. Claro, aquí has dado unos elementos en los que la pregunta es, la formación política no es solamente por un contenido político, sino es por el ejercicio del pensar político que me lleva a no pensar en mí mismo, sino a la pluralidad, a pensar en la construcción con los demás. Entonces, quisiera redondear un poco esa idea del pensamiento político. Digamos, un pensamiento político sobre la educación y la formación política. Luego, no sé, María, si tú estás viendo aquí el chat, porque hay un par de preguntas, o una pregunta propuesta por Raúl Poveda. No sé si tú lo puedes ver aquí o si quieres que yo te lo transmita.
I can't see it right now. So,
digamos, ¿sí?
So should I see it? Oh, yeah.
Aquí están. Based on the fact that Arendt preferred to be taken as a political theorist, not so as a philosopher or educator, what is your opinion on the events related to the loss of women's freedom in Iran? Raúl,
Okay.
in other countries such as Lebanon and Turkey, women also came out to protest cutting their hair and burning their hijab. What do you think Hannah Arendt's position would have been?
Okay, so I have to tell you that although this has fairly little to do with the main strings of my talk today, I also, in another project, work about feminist street protests. So I'm very interested in this perspective. And what we would have to do to understand these protests, like also protests in Iran and also other protests that you mentioned, and protests in Latin America, mostly feminist protests against sharpening of anti-abortion laws and protests against violence against women that were also taking place in Europe. We would have to refer to some different elements of her theory. So we would have to speak about not only action, and I even didn't take time in this talk to speak about action and what action actually means for her. And it also came to my mind when Maximiliano was summing up what I said, that it is important to think or to remember that Arendt was not speaking about politics in the sense of institutionalized politics or political parties or any kind of political system as we know them, but she's speaking about what happens when people come together. So for her, she was arguably a phenomenologist. So for her, this model of politics as a gathering of people who act freely and spontaneously. And maybe this aspect of action as spontaneous is a bit surprising here. It does not mean that like people act on a whim, but much more that they are not forced to act in any way. So this is also why she says about the past, even about history, that it could always have been otherwise. So people could have always acted differently than they actually did. This is also why she speaks not about the history of totalitarianism, but about elements that came together. So it is possible that when one or several elements that came together and crystallized, as she says, into a totalitarian movement were missing, or if those events went different, then this particular outcome would not come into the world. This having been said, I think speaking about events in Iran, because this is in particular what you addressed, is possible, taking into consideration her theory of acting, also her theory of judgment, actually, because it needs a certain, let's say, perspective on the world to actually gather courage. And courage is always necessary for Arendt to come out from the space that we perceive as our safe and maybe private home into the light of the public and actually act with the others, which Iranian women right now are doing in an exceptional way. So gathering this courage and making this judgment and willing to go out, this is something that can be, I think, theorized very well with Arendt. Another point is actually the feminist aspect of that, because Arendt was definitely not a feminist, and I could speak about it quite long, but it is beyond question. Arendt did, this is one of the interpretations, there are many, but Arendt was not an author interesting to feminists for a quite long time. She was criticized for many things that she wrote until the end of the 1980s. And then in the 1990s came a wave of feminist interpretations of Hannah Arendt that was based on this option of reading Arendt against Arendt, basically. So you would not really put the elements of her theory that were problematic for feminists, mainly the distinction between the private and the political, which is obviously one of the points that feminists were making during this time. So she was like really arguing completely against the grain of feminists. So it was seen as nearly impossible to read Arendt in a feminist way. But then the 90s came and some theorists said, well, okay, so this is the one thing, but let's take a look at everything else she's saying and how great it is for our agenda. And so this is exactly what happened and what is continuing until this day. And what I have to add to that is that after some studies about Arendt being also, and you remember, not a member of a club, but also a phenomenologist, we are able to read her theory and even her distinction between the private and the public in a different way. So this is the one thing. The other thing is we would have to reach for theories of revolution and civil disobedience. I am working on a text which is not about Iranian women, but it is about feminist protests in Arendtian perspective. And yeah, when it is at some point published, I hope, it will kind of, respond to your question in a way.
Okay, thank you. Ok, voy a trasladar otra pregunta, ok. Thanks a lot by the conference. I would like to know what do you think about the difficulties to introduce the political topic, especially at high school, having account the restrictions for teachers. Héctor, gracias porque además especifica la pregunta o la aclara. Y la segunda parte, the second part of his question is, I mean, the difficulties to abort any political topic in an impartial way. As you know, perdón.
Yeah.
As you know, we are in the middle of conflicts. Thank you.
Okay, I would have to ask back. About which conflicts are meant precisely. So I have some very limited knowledge about the situation in Colombia. I know that the conflict, like the civil war that was taking place, is at least not in the same way present in Colombia right now. I know also what is happening, and I would definitely describe it as a conflict connected to the liberalization of abortion laws that caused a backlash in form of Christian Catholic counter demonstrations. But could you specify that? perhaps for me.
Ok, sí, Héctor, para no yo reinterpretar su pregunta o ponerle el contexto, le pediría a Héctor si puede ahora complementar la pregunta con lo que la profesora María está señalando. Bueno, después Rafael Sarmiento nos dice, María, si puedes tú complementar, después compartirnos la presentación esta de PowerPoint, si es posible tener esa presentación más adelante.
If I understood that right, yes. I mean, it's a very minimal presentation, but let me go back very shortly to the question because the gist of the question was how to teach politics in the sense of, for example, exercising political thinking under the restrictions for teachers, who are unable to introduce any political subjects in an impartial way. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to this question, though, I have to say, because I myself am not a genuine educator. I'm just an academic teacher, which, as you know, is something completely different than being a school teacher or being a person like an expert in education. So it is a difficult situation because one of the very central skills also connected to a certain knowledge, but if we are speaking about skills, because seeing certain problems with political relevance from an impartial perspective, not in itself really possible, but like trying to get there, because there's no impartial perspective. But introducing maybe different perspectives and different ways of seeing a problem is exactly what critical education for politics should do. And if you are hindered in doing that, it's a very difficult situation, which is which actually does not go hand in hand with democratic education. And I'm sorry to hear this, and I'm sorry to hear that the conflicts are a part of the reasons that are hindering this possibility. I have to remind you, perhaps because Maximiliano already said that shortly, I come from Poland, where the political situation right now is extremely difficult, and we have a populist ruling party, which is very closely connected to the, I would say, harmful strains of the Catholic Church, and to the far right, and all this stuff. And our school curricula were, I don't even know what word to use. They were like completely crashed. And the entire education was being directed into this certain political direction. It's definitely in a situation of authoritarian rule, where certain books are not being read anymore, certain books are being read, certain things about like, I don't know, human sciences and human reproduction and so on are not being communicated. Very difficult. So at least if I don't have a good answer to your question, and I'm sorry for that, I definitely feel with you.
Bien, María, yo tengo una pregunta. Yo entiendo que la perspectiva, voy a partir como de la primera parte de mi intervención hace un momento, y es, aquí tenemos como una aproximación hacia la educación desde la filosofía política. que nos permite ver una posible o una cierta separación entre la educación y el mundo político. Mi pregunta es si aunque entiendo que no es el propósito de Arendt, pero si en Arendt podemos desarrollar una filosofía de la educación en la perspectiva de comprender qué es la educación, comprender qué son las escuelas, los colegios, comprender en qué consisten esos espacios y cómo se diferencian esos espacios sociales de otros espacios sociales o políticos. Es decir, si la filosofía política de Arendt, o el pensamiento político más bien, en Arendt, si indagamos, si profundizamos en él, puede llevarnos a una comprensión, digamos, de la educación por sí misma en una suerte de pensamiento pedagógico o quizá una filosofía de la educación.
Okay, so I will also base my answer on what I could understand from this question, but I think I could follow it quite well. So I think yes, it is possible. It is possible if you read Arendt against Arendt in some points, because this is always what we have to do, and this is why the way I'm reading her. So the way I read her writings as exercises in political thinking, as a judgment that is being made, but that could be rethought and revised and could be changed into something different, could be used for further thinking, you know, is a very fruitful way of working with her text in this respect. So I think what could happen is that let me spontaneously develop that. So what Arendt is doing, this is definitely a Heideggerian moment, is she practices some version of oh my God, I'm sorry, I've been speaking too long. The word I'm looking is well, let's say archaeology. I'm not very happy with this, but let's say, you know, like intellectual archaeology. So you go back to the origins of certain notions and so on and so forth, just to understand better the ways in which those concepts are being used right now. This is the idea. So she's doing that. She writes a lot about other philosophers, about the positions that she found interesting in the history of philosophy and in the history of politics. She's not, she does not always agree with the arguments. She's often very critical. But she makes her interpretation and she develops certain elements of her theories out of that. And I think this is why an education which in part consists in learning history, learning, well, in this case, maybe political and philosophical positions of the past. And even if we distance ourselves from that, I think, for example, I think it is really helpful to have read Hobbes once, you know, because we know that the natural condition is a thought experiment. But, you know, imagining this situation, even if we know it's not historical, imagining this situation, you know, the war of everyone against everyone else, is something that is, I think, a very fruitful point to start thinking about how we act together and how this world works, how it could work, how it does not work, but we would wish it to. And, you know, so I think a part of what you can do, except for taking actual cases from the world and trying to, like form judgments with your students about them. And I know there's not much space in school to do that. It's just to get acquainted with those positions from the past, to see what's possible theoretically, and how it developed, and what people would think in different times and in different places. So I think, I don't know, it's quite conservative, but I think it's very important.
Cuando en ocasiones, bueno, disculpen que yo estoy haciendo más preguntas mientras otra persona hace preguntas, pero es que me interesa mucho ese tema que has tratado hoy. En ocasiones, cuando algún planteamiento teórico separa la educación del mundo social o político, hay reacciones porque se piensa que eso haría, o el riesgo allí es que la educación sea algo así como una burbuja aislada del mundo exterior, a la educación, ¿no? Entonces, cuando se dice que hay separación entre educación y el mundo externo a la educación, muchas veces, repito, se piensa que eso necesariamente implica que la educación es algo aislado o encerrado en sí mismo. Pero creo que con Arendt uno puede separar educación y mundo político, pero a la vez comunicarlos bajo la idea de preparación, bajo la idea de ejercicio, bajo la idea de juicio reflectivo, etc. Es decir, es posible separarlos, pero al mismo tiempo unirlos bajo la idea de esa preparación. ¿Esta sería una correcta interpretación de Arendt?
Okay, first, I don't think there's a correct interpretation of Arendt of any kind. Okay, so I would, I think the only thing you have to remember about when reading her writings always is plurality. So there are definitely incorrect interpretations.
Okay.
But I don't think there's a correct one.
Correct.
So
Okay.
If I understood you right, and it was a challenge for me, not because of you, obviously, but because of my language skills, I would say yes. And I would say that what I was speaking about in the sense of education for judgment offers an opportunity to do that, as long as you assume that exercising judgment in school is being done on the same right as exercising judgment in political space. It is obviously so that the school is to a certain degree, because if we take a look at school history, and again, I am not very well informed about that, but what I know, for example, if you allow me to go back to my home country again, what I know is that during the time in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, when the Polish state was non-existent, it were schools where opposition and resistance were built. So schools were suddenly very political institutions. And these were, in most cases, not official schools of the Russian, Austrian, and German regime, or Prussian regime, but rather clandestine schools, but still schools. So still institutions of education. And these were the places where dissent and oppositional thinking and acting would take place. And I lost the connection to what I was speaking before a little bit. But I think in this sense, historically speaking, I would not want to argue that a school is per se an impolitical institution. What also comes to my mind is what Bell Hooks wrote about school desegregation. I don't remember how the essay was called, but she wrote that as long as her school was purely Black, children would come and teachers would inspire them to certain ways of thinking, to certain ways of acting, sparking their willingness to go into the public and to do certain things. So it was so energizing and so on. And she loved to go to school. And then the segregation came, and she went to a different school where everything was mixed, and school suddenly, all of a sudden, became a place of transferring knowledge only. And then she said that was the end for me. So it was totally, I was not at all motivated to go to school because it was so boring. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I would not say that school is per se a non-political institution. Then I would say perhaps a school in a democratic system is not supposed to be overly political, for the reason probably not to transport ideologies. But still, since the idea of reflective judgment is about different perspectives, it's about gathering as many as you can and going beyond your way of thinking and your own opinions and I think this is a very democratic way of politicizing school. So I think it's not the worst idea of them all.
Okay. Thank you. Bueno, María, creo que podemos terminar por hoy. Muchas gracias por tu conferencia, por la respuesta también a las preguntas, por el tiempo que nos has dedicado hoy aquí a la Universidad Pedagógica. Esperamos tenerte de nuevo por acá en el futuro. Sería para nosotros pues muy grato poder seguir conversando contigo. Quizá esto se pueda concretar más adelante, ya lo veremos, intentaremos hacerlo. Muchas gracias, María.
Gracias por tu invitación, and I very much hope that I will come back in the best case
puedes terminar hablando un poco de español.
Muchas gracias y es todo lo que puedo decir.
Ok, muchas gracias a ti, María, y que tengas una buena noche, que descanses. Muchas gracias. Bueno, hasta luego también a todos los que siguieron hoy la cátedra. Nos veremos dentro de 8 días. Ya les enviaremos entonces la información sobre la siguiente lección. Muchas gracias a todos.